Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she loaded the last of her camping gear into the back of her old Toyota pickup truck. The sun was just beginning to rise over the mountains of Southern California, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. At 28 years old, Maria had always been drawn to adventure, but this trip to the Mojave Desert was different. She needed time alone to think about the divorce papers sitting on her kitchen table back home. Her marriage to David had been falling apart for months. The constant arguing, the silence that followed, and the feeling that they had become strangers living in the same house had finally pushed her to make a decision. But before she signed those papers, she needed clarity. The desert had always been her place of peace, where the vastness of the landscape helped put her problems into perspective. Maria's best friend, Jessica, had tried to talk her out of going alone. The desert is dangerous, she had warned over coffee the night before. What if something happens? What if your truck breaks down? But Maria had brushed off her concerns. She was an experienced hiker and camper. She had GPS, plenty of water, and her cell phone. What could go wrong? As she drove through the small town of 29 Palms, Maria stopped at the last gas station to fill up her tank and buy some extra water bottles. The elderly man behind the counter, Frank, noticed her camping gear and struck up a conversation. "Heading into the desert alone, miss?" he asked, his weathered face showing concern. "Yes, just for a few days. I need some time to think," Maria replied, paying for her purchases. Frank shook his head slowly. "Been living here for 40 years, and I've seen too many folks get into trouble out there. Desert's beautiful, but it's not forgiving. You got enough water? Extra food? What about your vehicle? When was it last serviced?" Maria appreciated his concern, but felt confident in her preparation. "I've got everything I need. My truck runs fine, and I know the area pretty well." As she drove away from the gas station, Maria felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The road stretched ahead, leading into the vast expanse of the Mojave Desert. Joshua trees dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels, and in the distance, rugged mountains rose against the clear blue sky. Her destination was a remote camping spot she had visited twice before with David during happier times. It was about 50 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a rough dirt track that wound through rocky terrain and sandy washes. The isolation was what drew her there. No other campers, no noise except the wind and the occasional call of a desert bird. After driving for 2 hours on increasingly rough roads, Maria reached her campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by large boulders that provided some shelter from the wind. A few hardy desert plants grew nearby, and the view stretched for miles in every direction. She felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as she stepped out of her truck and breathed in the dry, clean air. Setting up camp took most of the morning. She pitched her tent in the shade of the largest boulder, arranged her camping chairs around a circle of stones for a fire pit, and organized her supplies. By noon, the temperature had climbed to over 90 degrees, so she retreated to the shade to rest and have lunch. As the afternoon wore on, Maria decided to take a short hike to a ridge about a mile from her campsite. The view from there was spectacular. She could see for what seemed like hundreds of miles across the desert floor. She sat on a flat rock and pulled out the photo she had brought with her. It was from her wedding day 5 years ago, showing her and David laughing together, their faces full of hope and love. Looking at that photo now, she tried to remember when things had started going wrong. Was it when David lost his job last year and became distant and moody? Or had it started earlier, when they had stopped talking about their dreams and began just going through the motions of daily life? Maybe they had both changed, grown in different directions without realizing it. The desert's silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks. Maria found herself crying for the first time in months, not the angry tears that had come during their fights, but sad, cleansing tears for what they had lost. She stayed on the ridge until sunset, watching the sky change colors as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains. When she returned to her campsite, Maria built a small fire and heated up a can of soup for dinner. The flames danced in the darkness, and above her, the stars began to appear in numbers she never saw back in the city. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace settling over her. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Maria woke early, before the sun had risen above the surrounding rocks. She made coffee on her camp stove and sat watching the desert come alive with the new day. Small lizards scurried among the rocks, and she spotted a roadrunner in the distance, moving with quick, jerky steps through the brush. After breakfast, she decided to explore a different area. She had noticed a deep canyon about 3 miles to the east during her hike the previous day. The terrain looked challenging but not impossible, and she was curious to see what lay beyond the canyon rim. Maria packed her day pack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and her GPS device. She left a note in her tent explaining where she was going and what time she expected to return, a basic safety precaution her father had taught her years ago. The note read, "Gone to explore Eastern Canyon. Left at 8 a.m., should return by 3 p.m. If not back by dark, follow GPS coordinates to find me." The hike started easily enough. The ground was mostly flat, covered with scattered rocks and hardy desert plants. But as she got closer to the canyon, the terrain became more difficult. She had to climb over large boulders and navigate around deep gullies carved by flash floods. About halfway to the canyon, Maria's GPS device started acting strangely. The screen flickered and then went black. She tried turning it off and on again, but nothing happened. The battery indicator had shown half full that morning, so she couldn't understand what was wrong. "Not a big deal," she said aloud, her voice sounding small in the vast landscape. "I can follow my own tracks back." She looked behind her, but the rocky ground didn't show clear footprints. Still, she felt confident she could retrace her route. The canyon, when she finally reached it, was more impressive than she had expected. It cut deep into the earth, its red and tan walls carved into fantastic shapes by centuries of wind and water. She spent an hour exploring the rim, taking photos and marveling at the geological history written in the rock layers. By the time she started back, the sun was directly overhead, and the temperature was approaching 100 degrees. Maria had drunk more water than she had planned, but she still had plenty for the return trip, or so she thought. The problem began when she tried to find her way around a large rock formation that she didn't remember passing on the way out. She was sure she had come straight across the flat area, but now there seemed to be obstacles everywhere. The sun was disorienting, and without her GPS, she found it hard to determine which direction was which. After an hour of walking, Maria realized she was lost. The landscape all looked the same: rocks, scrub brush, and endless blue sky. She could no longer see her campsite or any familiar landmarks. Panic began to creep into her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Think, Maria," she said to herself. "You know the basics. Stay where you are, conserve water, and someone will look for you." But who would look for her? She had told Jessica she would be back in 3 days, but that wasn't until tomorrow. David wouldn't expect to hear from her. They weren't talking much these days. Her parents were traveling in Europe. The realization hit her that no one would miss her for at least 24 hours, maybe longer. She found a large boulder that provided some shade and sat down to think. Her water bottles were half empty, and the temperature was still rising. She had a few energy bars in her pack, but no substantial food. Her cell phone showed no signal, which she had expected in this remote area. The first rule of desert survival, she remembered from a class she had taken years ago, was to stay put and conserve energy. Moving around in the heat would only make her dehydrate faster. She decided to wait until evening when it was cooler to try to find her way back. As the afternoon dragged on, the heat became almost unbearable. Even in the shade, the temperature must have been over 100 degrees. Maria rationed her water, taking only small sips when her throat became too dry to swallow. She used her spare shirt to create more shade and tried to stay as still as possible. The waiting was the hardest part. Her mind kept racing with worst-case scenarios. What if no one found her? What if she ran out of water? She had read stories about people dying in the desert after just a few days. The thought terrified her, but she pushed it away and focused on staying calm. As evening approached, the temperature finally began to drop. Maria felt strong enough to start moving again. She climbed to the top of the highest nearby rock formation and looked in all directions, hoping to spot her campsite or some familiar landmark. But everything looked the same in the fading light. She chose a direction that felt right and started walking. After an hour, she came across a dry creek bed that she didn't remember seeing before. The smart thing would have been to turn back, but she was getting desperate. She followed the creek bed, hoping it might lead to a road or at least a higher ground where she could get a better view. The creek bed wound through increasingly rough terrain. As darkness fell, Maria was forced to stop. She couldn't risk walking in the dark and injuring herself. She found a protected spot between some large rocks and settled in for what she knew would be a difficult night. The desert night was surprisingly cold. Without her sleeping bag, Maria shivered in her light clothing. She had left her jacket back at the campsite, not thinking she would need it for a day hike. The temperature dropped into the 50s, a shocking contrast to the daytime heat. She dozed fitfully, waking every hour or so to the sounds of the desert night. Coyotes howled in the distance, and she heard the rustle of small animals moving through the brush nearby. Every sound made her heart race, even though she knew that most desert animals were more afraid of her than she was of them. By morning, Maria was exhausted, thirsty, and starting to feel genuinely frightened. She had less than half a bottle of water left, and her lips were already cracked from dehydration. Her head pounded, and she felt dizzy when she stood up. The second day was worse than the first. The sun seemed hotter, and her water ran out by noon. She tried to stay in whatever shade she could find, but the landscape offered little relief. By afternoon, she was beginning to hallucinate, seeing mirages of water and buildings in the distance. That evening, as she struggled to find shelter for another night, Maria began to accept that she might not survive this ordeal. She thought about David, about the divorce papers still sitting unsigned on her kitchen table. How stupid those problems seemed now. She thought about her parents, about Jessica, about all the things she had wanted to do with her life. She found a cave-like opening between two large boulders. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his headset as the Navy helicopter approached the designated search area. As a Navy SEAL with 15 years of experience, he had participated in dozens of rescue operations around the world, but this domestic search and rescue mission was different from his usual assignments in hostile territories overseas. The call had come in early that morning through the Emergency Coordination Center. A woman named Jessica Chun had reported her best friend missing after she failed to return from a solo camping trip in the Mojave Desert. The missing woman, Maria Santos, had told Jessica she would be back by Wednesday evening, but it was now Friday morning with no word from her. Jake's team was conducting training exercises at the nearby Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center when they received the request for assistance. The local search and rescue teams were stretched thin due to budget cuts, and the vast area that needed to be covered required military resources. Jake volunteered immediately. He had grown up in Southern California and knew how deadly the desert could be for unprepared or unlucky travelers. His crew chief, Petty Officer First Class Roberto Bobby Valdez, was scanning the landscape below through high-powered binoculars. Bobby had sharp eyes and an intuitive sense for spotting signs of human presence in difficult terrain. Behind them, Navy medic Sarah Chin checked and rechecked her medical supplies, preparing for whatever condition they might find the missing woman in. "Sir, we've been searching for 3 hours now," Bobby reported through the intercom. "No sign of the vehicle or any campsite. The GPS coordinates her friend provided put us in the right general area, but it's a lot of ground to cover." Jake nodded, studying the terrain map spread across his lap. They had been flying a grid pattern over the area where Maria's cell phone had last pinged a cell tower before going dark. The ping had been weak and the location approximate, but it was their best lead. The problem was that the search area covered nearly 50 square miles of extremely rough desert terrain. "How much fuel do we have left?" Jake asked the pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Dave Park. "About 2 hours of search time before we need to return to base," Dave replied. "Weather report says winds are picking up this afternoon, which could ground us until tomorrow morning." Jake felt the familiar pressure that came with time-sensitive rescue operations. If Maria Santos was still alive out there, every hour counted. Desert survival was a race against dehydration, exposure, and disorientation. Most people could survive 3 days without water, but In the extreme heat of the Mojave, that timeline could be much shorter. Through his own binoculars, Jake studied the landscape below. The terrain was a mixture of flat desert floor broken by rock formations, deep washes carved by flash floods, and scattered clusters of Joshua trees. Finding one person in all this vastness seemed almost impossible, but he had learned during his SEAL training that impossible was just another word for difficult. Let's expand the search pattern to the east, Jake decided. She might have gotten disoriented and wandered further from her intended campsite than anyone thought. As they flew toward a new section of desert, Jake thought about what he knew about Maria Santos from the briefing. 28 years old, experienced hiker and camper, drove a blue Toyota pickup truck. Her friend Jessica had described her as responsible and well-prepared, not the type to take unnecessary risks. But Jake also knew that experience meant nothing when things went wrong in the desert. He had seen Navy SEALs, some of the toughest and best-trained people in the world, brought down by heat exhaustion and dehydration. The helicopter swept over another empty stretch of desert, and Jake began to consider the possibility that they might not find her alive. It was a thought he never allowed himself to dwell on. But, as a realistic professional, he knew he had to prepare for all possibilities. If they found her vehicle, it might provide clues about which direction she had gone. If they found her body, at least her family would have closure. Contact, Bobby suddenly shouted through the intercom. Blue vehicle, 11 o'clock, about 2 miles ahead. Everyone in the helicopter immediately focused their attention on the spot Bobby had indicated. Sure enough, there was a blue pickup truck parked in a small clearing surrounded by large boulders. It matched the description of Maria's vehicle perfectly. Take us down for a closer look, Jake ordered. As they approached the campsite, they could see that it was set up, but appeared abandoned. A tent was still standing, camping chairs were arranged around a cold fire pit, and supplies were scattered around the area. But there was no sign of Maria herself. Dave found a flat area about 100 yards from the campsite, where he could safely land the helicopter. As soon as they touched down, Jake and Bobby jumped out and ran toward the camp while Sarah remained with the aircraft to maintain radio contact with the Rescue Coordination Center. The campsite told a story. Jake found a note in Maria's tent that explained she had gone to explore an eastern canyon and expected to return by 3 p.m. The note was dated 3 days ago. Her sleeping bag was still laid out, and there was food and water in her supplies, enough to last several more days if she had been at the campsite to use it. She went that way, Bobby said, pointing toward the east. He had found some faint footprints leading away from the camp. But, sir, these tracks are 3 days old. She could be anywhere by now. Jake studied the terrain in the direction Maria had gone. It was rough country, full of ridges and canyons where someone could easily become lost or injured. The fact that she hadn't returned to her well-supplied campsite meant something had gone seriously wrong. Get on the radio to the coordination center, Jake told Bobby. Tell them we found the base camp, but the subject is still missing. We need to extend our search time and get additional resources if possible. While Bobby made the radio call, Jake continued to examine the campsite for clues. He found Maria's main backpack, which contained extra water and food, supplies she would have taken with her on a longer hike. This suggested she had planned only a short day trip and expected to return quickly. In the tent, he found something that made his chest tighten, a wedding photo and a stack of divorce papers. Suddenly, Maria Santos became more than just another search and rescue case. She was a real person with real problems, someone who had come to the desert looking for solitude and clarity, only to find herself in a life-threatening situation. Sir, Coordination Center says we can extend our search time by 1 hour, Bobby reported. Local ground teams are mobilizing, but they won't reach this area until tomorrow morning. 1 hour. Jake looked at the vast landscape stretching to the east and calculated their chances. If Maria was still alive, she was probably severely dehydrated and might not be able to signal them. She could be unconscious in the shade of a rock formation, or she might have fallen into one of the many hidden gullies that crisscrossed the area. We'll use the time we have, Jake decided. Let's follow her probable route and look for any sign, tracks, clothing, anything that shows she passed through an area. They took off again and began following the eastern route Maria had indicated in her note. Flying low and slow, they carefully examined every possible hiding spot where a person might take shelter from the sun. The desert below was a maze of rock formations, each one potentially concealing someone in distress. After 30 minutes of intensive searching, they had found nothing. Jake began to worry that Maria might have changed direction, become completely disoriented, or worse. The helicopter's fuel gauge was dropping steadily, and they would soon be forced to return to base. Look for any kind of reflection or unusual color, Jake instructed his team. Bright clothing, a mirror signal, anything that doesn't belong in the natural landscape. Sarah, the medic, had been quiet during most of the search, but now she spoke up. Sir, if she's been out here for 3 days without water, she might not be conscious enough to signal us. We should look for any kind of shelter where she might have tried to escape the sun. It was a good point. Jake adjusted their search pattern to focus on areas that provided natural shelter, overhanging rocks, deep shadows between boulders, cave-like openings in rock formations. These were the places where someone dying of thirst and exposure would instinctively seek protection. They were approaching the limits of their search area when Bobby spotted something unusual. Sir, there's some kind of disturbance in the rocks ahead, 2 o'clock. Looks like maybe someone moved some of the smaller stones. Jake looked where Bobby was pointing and saw what appeared to be a makeshift shelter constructed between 2 large boulders. Someone had arranged smaller rocks to create additional windbreak and shade. It was exactly the kind of survival technique he would expect from someone with outdoor experience. Take us closer, he ordered. As they approached the shelter, Jake felt his pulse quicken. There, angled against one of the rocks, was a small mirror catching and reflecting the afternoon sunlight. It was definitely a signal mirror, the kind sold in outdoor survival kits. That's her, Jake said with certainty. Someone's down there with a signal mirror. But, even as they flew directly over the shelter, they couldn't see Maria herself. The opening between the rocks was deep and narrow, creating shadows that their eyes couldn't penetrate from above. Dave found a landing spot about 50 yards away, and Jake grabbed his medical kit and rappelling gear. If Maria was in that shelter, she was probably too weak to come out on her own. He would have to go down and get her. The shelter was even smaller than it had appeared from the air. Jake had to crawl on his hands and knees to get inside the narrow opening between the boulders. What he found there made his heart race. Maria Santos was lying unconscious in the deepest part of the shelter, her body curled in a protective position. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin was severely sunburned, and she was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. Jake immediately checked for a pulse. It was rapid and weak, but she was still alive. Sarah, get down here now, he called through his radio. Subject located, alive, but critical condition. Severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. While waiting for the medic, Jake began basic first aid. He used his own water to moisten Maria's lips and gently dripped small amounts into her mouth. She was unconscious, but her swallowing reflex was still working. He covered her with his jacket to protect her damaged skin from further sun exposure and began checking for other injuries. Sarah arrived within minutes, carrying her medical supplies and a portable kit. She quickly assessed Maria's condition while Jake provided assistance. Pulse 120 and weak, blood pressure low, severe dehydration, Sarah reported efficiently. I'm starting in 4 with normal saline. We need to get her core temperature down and get fluids into her system fast. Working as a team, they carefully moved Maria out of the shelter and into the shade of the helicopter. Sarah established the 4 line, while Jake used wet cloths to cool Maria's overheated body. Bobby had prepared a stretcher and was coordinating with the pilot for immediate departure. How long has she been like this? Sarah asked as she monitored Maria's vital signs. Jake looked at the survival shelter Maria had built, at the signal mirror still propped against the rock. Hard to say, but she's been fighting to stay alive. Look at this shelter. She used survival techniques to protect herself from the elements. And that signal mirror saved her life. She was conscious enough to use it when she heard us coming. As they loaded Maria onto the stretcher, Jake noticed something in her hand. It was the wedding photo he had seen in her tent, now wrinkled and stained but still clutched in her fingers. Even in her desperate situation, she had held on to something that connected her to her life, to her reason to keep fighting. The helicopter lifted off with Maria secured in the patient bay. Sarah continued to monitor her condition and administer fluids through the foreline. Her vital signs were slowly stabilizing, but she remained unconscious. "How far to the nearest hospital?" Jake asked Dave over the intercom. "Desert Regional Medical Center is 25 minutes away," Dave replied. "I've already radioed ahead. They'll have a trauma team standing by." During the flight, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the determination Maria had shown. She had survived 3 days in one of the most hostile environments on Earth through a combination of knowledge, willpower, and luck. The survival shelter she had built was textbook perfect, and her use of the signal mirror had been exactly right. But what impressed him most was that she had never given up hope. As they approached the hospital, Maria began to show signs of regaining consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made soft moaning sounds. Sarah immediately leaned over her. "Maria, can you hear me? You're safe now. We're taking Yo." Maria Santos slowly opened her eyes to the harsh fluorescent lighting of a hospital room. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and every muscle in her body ached. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then, the memories came flooding back: the desert, the terrible thirst, the sound of helicopter rotors, and the overwhelming relief when she realized someone had seen her signal. A nurse noticed she was awake and immediately came to her bedside. "Maria? I'm Linda, your nurse. You're at Desert Regional Medical Center. You were rescued from the desert yesterday evening. How are you feeling?" "Water," Maria managed to croak, her voice barely audible. Linda helped her sip small amounts of water through a straw. "Take it slowly. Your body needs time to adjust. You were severely dehydrated when you arrived." Over the next few hours, as Maria gradually regained her strength, she learned the full story of her rescue. Dr. Martinez, the emergency physician who had treated her, explained that she had been very close to kidney failure when the Navy helicopter brought her in. Another day in the desert would likely have been fatal. "You did everything right," Dr. Martinez told her during his morning rounds. "The shelter you built, rationing what water you had, using the signal mirror, those actions saved your life. Someone taught you well." Maria thought of her father, who had insisted she take survival courses before her first camping trip years ago. She had complained at the time that the classes were boring and unnecessary. Now she realized they had literally saved her life. The story of her rescue had attracted media attention, and by the second day, reporters were calling the hospital asking for interviews. Maria wasn't ready to talk to the press, but she was eager to meet the people who had saved her life. When she learned that Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison and his crew were stationed nearby, she asked the hospital to contact them. Jake visited Maria on her 3rd day in the hospital. She was sitting up in bed, looking much better but still bearing the marks of her ordeal: sunburned skin, cracked lips, and the hollow look that came with severe dehydration. But her eyes were alert and determined. "I don't know how to thank you," Maria said as soon as Jake entered the room. "The nurse told me you're the one who found me." Jake pulled up a chair beside her bed. "You saved yourself, ma'am. That survival shelter was perfectly constructed, and using the signal mirror showed real presence of mind. Most people in your situation would have panicked." Maria shook her head. "I almost did panic. There were times when I thought about just giving up, lying down, and letting it end. What kept me going was thinking about the people I love, the things I still wanted to do with my life." They talked for nearly an hour. Jake told her about the search operation, how they had found her campsite and followed her trail to the canyon area. Maria described her experience getting lost, the terrible second day without water, and the moment when she heard the helicopter and realized she might survive. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said as Jake was preparing to leave. "Why did you volunteer for civilian search and rescue? I mean, you're a Navy SEAL. You must have more important missions." Jake considered the question carefully. "Because every life matters. Whether it's a fellow soldier overseas or a hiker lost in the desert, the mission is the same: bring people home safely." After Jake left, Maria reflected on his words and on everything that had happened to her. The desert had nearly killed her, but it had also given her something precious: a new perspective on what truly mattered in life. The problems that had seemed so overwhelming before her trip now felt manageable, even the painful decision about her marriage. When Jessica finally arrived from Los Angeles, she was crying before she even entered Maria's hospital room. "I'm so sorry I let you go alone," she sobbed. "I should have insisted on coming with you." "No," Maria said firmly, hugging her best friend. "This is something I needed to experience alone. And I'm going to be okay, more than okay." The next visitor surprised Maria completely. David, her estranged husband, appeared in her doorway on the fourth day, looking uncertain and worried. She hadn't seen him in 2 weeks, not since their last terrible argument about the divorce. "I heard what happened on the news," he said quietly. "I had to come see if you were all right." Looking at David's face, Maria saw something she hadn't seen in months: genuine emotion, real concern for her well-being. Not the anger or resentment that had characterized their recent interactions, but the caring that had originally brought them together. "I'm going to be fine," she told him. "The doctors say I can go home tomorrow." David sat down awkwardly in the visitor's chair. "I kept thinking about what I would do if something happened to you before we could figure things out. The thought of losing you permanently, not just through divorce, but really losing you." His voice trailed off. They talked tentatively at first, both afraid of saying the wrong thing and reigniting their old conflicts. But gradually, the conversation became more open and honest than any they had shared in months. Being face to face with the possibility of death had stripped away Maria's anger and defensiveness. For his part, David seemed to realize that his pride and stubbornness were less important than the woman he had nearly lost. "I found something in the desert," Maria said, pulling the wrinkled wedding photo from her bedside table. "I was carrying this with me when they found me. Even when I thought I was going to die, I couldn't let go of it." David looked at the photo, his eyes filling with tears. "I still have our wedding album. I was looking through it last night, remembering how happy we were." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stood in the doorway with a large bouquet of desert wildflowers and a serious expression on his face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "I wanted to check on you before my unit ships out, but I can come back later if this is a bad time." "No, please come in," Maria said quickly. "David, I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Commander Morrison." "Jake, this is my husband, David." The two men shook hands, and Jake could sense the tension in the room. But he also noticed that David and Maria were sitting closer together than when he had visited before, and there was something different in the way they looked at each other. "I brought you something," Jake said, handing Maria a small package along with the flowers. "It's a replacement for the signal mirror you used. You should never go into the desert without one again." Inside the package was a high-quality signal mirror along with a comprehensive survival kit. But there was also something else, a handwritten note from the entire helicopter crew, thanking her for giving them the opportunity to save a life. "We wanted you to know," Jake said, "that finding you, seeing your determination to survive, reminded all of us why we do what we do. You inspired us as much as we helped you." After Jake left, David and Maria continued their conversation. The presence of the man who had risked his life to save her had somehow made their marital problems seem smaller and more solvable. "I want to try again," David said finally. "I know we have problems, but what happened to you made me realize that I'd rather work through them together than lose you completely." Maria reached for his hand. "I want to try too, but we need to do things differently. We need to talk to each other instead of just getting angry. We need to remember why we fell in love in the first place." Over the following weeks, as Maria recovered fully from her desert ordeal, she and David began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. They started with counseling, working with a therapist to address the communication problems and resentments that had driven them apart. The media attention for Maria's rescue continued for several weeks. She was interviewed by local television stations and a national magazine about her survival experience. But, more importantly, she began speaking at wilderness safety seminars, teaching other outdoor enthusiasts about desert survival techniques. "The desert taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was," she would tell audiences. "But it also taught me that strength doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is signal for help." 3 months after her rescue, Maria returned to the desert for the first time. David came with her, along with Jake Morrison, who had become a close friend to both of them. They visited her original campsite and the location where she had built her survival shelter. Standing in the place where she had nearly died, Maria felt not fear, but gratitude. The desert had taken her to the edge of death, but had also given her back her life in ways she never could have imagined. "Thank you," she said quietly to the vast landscape stretching before them. Jake, who was preparing for deployment to Afghanistan, had asked to join them on this return trip. "I wanted to see this place in a different context," he explained. "Usually, I only see places like this during emergencies. I wanted to understand what draws people to come here willingly." As they explored the area together, Jake began to understand the appeal of the desert. Away from the life-or-death urgency of a rescue operation, he could appreciate its stark beauty and the sense of peace it offered to those who approached it with proper respect and preparation. The shelter Maria had built was still there, partially collapsed but still recognizable. They rebuilt it together, and Jake was impressed once again by Maria's survival instincts and knowledge. "You know," he said as they worked, "we use your story in our training now. It's a perfect example of how knowledge, determination, and a little luck can overcome seemingly impossible odds." That evening, as they sat around a campfire at Maria's original campsite, the three of them shared stories and reflected on how much their lives had changed since that day in the desert. Jake spoke about his upcoming deployment and his hopes of transitioning to a career in civilian search and rescue when he left the military. David talked about his new job and how nearly losing Maria had helped him prioritize what really mattered to him. "I keep thinking about something Jake said in the hospital," Maria told them, "about how every life matters, whether it's a soldier overseas or a hiker lost in the desert. I want to find a way to live that principle in my daily life." Inspired by her experience, Maria had decided to train as an emergency medical technician and volunteer with the local search and rescue team. She wanted to give back some of what had been given to her. 6 months later, Maria responded to her first search and rescue call as a certified EMT. A teenage boy had become separated from his family during a hiking trip in the same general area where she had been lost. Using the survival skills she had learned the hard way and the new medical training she had acquired, Maria was part of the team that found the boy safe and unharmed after only 6 hours. "How did you know to look in that particular area?" the boy's grateful mother asked after the rescue. Maria smiled, thinking of Jake Morrison and his crew, of the survival shelter that had kept her alive, and of the signal mirror that had brought salvation when hope seemed lost. "Sometimes you just have to know where someone would go to survive," she said simply. The desert had nearly claimed her life, but in trying to take everything from her, it had instead given her a new understanding of what life could be. Her marriage was stronger than ever, built now on a foundation of honest communication and mutual support rather than just romantic love. Her relationship with David had been tested by her brush with death and had emerged deeper and more resilient. Jake Morrison kept in touch with Maria and David through emails and occasional visits when he was stateside. His friendship with them had shown him that the bonds formed during crisis situations could evolve into lasting connections that enriched everyone involved. A year after her rescue, Maria stood once again in the desert, but this time she was leading a wilderness survival course for other outdoor enthusiasts. As she taught her students how to build emergency shelters and use signal mirrors, she often thought about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. "The most important survival tool," she would tell her students, "isn't something you carry in your pack. It's the determination to never give up hope, even when everything seems impossible." The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. But Maria no longer feared it. She had learned to respect its power while understanding that with knowledge, preparation, and a bit of luck, even the most hostile environment could be survived. And sometimes, she knew, survival was just the beginning of something much bigger than you ever imagined possible. "You to a hospital?" Maria's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and confused. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't try to talk right now," Sarah said gently. "Just rest. You're going to be okay." The helicopter landed on the hospital's helipad, where a trauma team was already waiting. Jake and Bobby helped transfer Maria from the helicopter to a hospital gurney, and she was quickly wheeled into the emergency department. As Jake watched the hospital doors close behind Maria and the medical team, he felt the satisfaction that came with a successful rescue. But he also felt something more, a deep respect for the woman they had just saved. She had faced death in the desert and refused to surrender. Later, as the helicopter crew completed their post-mission paperwork, Jake learned more about Maria's story. Her friend Jessica had been the one who raised the alarm when Maria didn't return as scheduled. The divorce papers in Maria's tent told a story of personal struggle that had led her to seek solitude in the desert. "Think she'll be okay?" Bobby asked as they walked away from the helicopter. Jake thought about the survival shelter, the signal mirror, and the wedding photo clutched in Maria's hand. "She's a fighter. She'll make it." What Jake didn't know was that Maria's ordeal in the desert was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would transform not only her own life, but also the lives of the people who had risked everything to save her. And crawled inside. As she lay there in the darkness, Maria made a promise to herself. If she survived this, she would stop taking her life for granted. She would fight for her marriage if there was anything left to fight for, or she would find the courage to start over. But she wouldn't waste any more time being miserable. The third day was a blur of heat, thirst, and desperation. Maria's water had been gone since the previous afternoon, and she was severely dehydrated. She could barely think clearly, and her movements were slow and uncoordinated. She had stopped sweating, which she knew was a dangerous sign. During the hottest part of the day, she found a small patch of shade under an overhanging rock and lay there, barely conscious. Her skin was burned and blistered from the sun, and her tongue felt swollen in her mouth. She drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes dreaming she was back home in her air-conditioned house, sometimes sure she could hear rescue helicopters in the distance. It was during one of these delirious episodes that she first heard the real sound of helicopter rotors. At first, she thought it was another hallucination, but the sound grew louder and more distinct, and she realized that somewhere above her, a helicopter was flying over the desert. With the last of her strength, Maria crawled out of her shelter and looked up at the sky. There, perhaps a mile away, she could see a military helicopter moving slowly across the landscape. She tried to wave her arms, but she was too weak to make much movement. The helicopter continued on its path and disappeared over a ridge. Maria collapsed back into the shade, overwhelmed with despair. She had been so close to rescue, but they hadn't seen her. She closed her eyes and tried to accept that this might be how her story ended, alone in the desert, her body becoming just another cautionary tale about the dangers of hiking alone. But something inside her refused to give up. As she lay there, she remembered the mirror in her day pack, part of the emergency signaling kit she had bought years ago but never expected to use. With trembling hands, she pulled it out and waited. If another aircraft came by, she would be ready. The waiting seemed endless. The sun began to sink toward the western horizon, and Maria's hope faded with the daylight. But then, just as she was about to give up, she heard the sound again. Helicopter rotors, coming from the same direction as before. This time, she was ready. As the aircraft came into view, Maria angled the mirror to catch the last rays of sunlight and flashed it toward the helicopter. The reflection created a bright beacon that danced across the desert floor. She flashed it again and again, using the last of her energy to maintain the signal. For a moment, the helicopter continued on its course, and Maria thought she had failed again. But then, slowly, the aircraft began to turn in her direction.